Modern American policy regarding China was formulated during the Nixon and Reagan administrations. President Nixon brought Beijing in from the diplomatic cold when he made his famous trip to the Chinese capital to meet Chairman Mao Zedong in 1972. 7 years later, the United States and the People's Republic of China released a joint communique formally switching diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. It was Nixon's strong belief that the outstanding abilities of the Chinese people would propel them to world leadership.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair.
With Reagan came the third communique of August the 17th, 1982. Through this, according to Nixon's former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, China achieved another decade of American assistance as it built its economic and military power and its capacity to play an independent role in world affairs. President Reagan visited China himself in 1984.
Mr. President, your China trip will soon come to its end. Could you tell us what impresses you most during this visit and what impressions you especially want to convey to American young people when you are back home?
What impressed me most? I'm still sorting it out. It's a kaleidoscope. One thing above all that impressed me, and almost before we got to the guest house in Beijing when we flew in the other day, was the warmth and the friendliness of you, the Chinese people, toward us. It was a most, and has been a most heartwarming experience ever since we've been here. We shall remember it for a long, long time.
Disagreements about political ideology and Taiwan simmered through the 1970s and 80s. But the common goal of economic development formed the basis of a workable understanding, which included deals on technology transfers, tax laws, and arms sales. By the time the Obama administration was in office, the US president was publicly stating that he, quote, welcomed the rise of China. In 2011, Joe Biden, then Vice President of the United States, traveled to China for a 6-day visit. He was accompanied on this tour by the then Vice President of China, Xi Jinping. One of the goals of the visit was for the two men to form a, quote, deep, personal relationship. 2 years later, after Xi, by then President of China, had proposed a new type of great power relationship that would essentially see the two powers sharing the Pacific theater, US National Security Advisor Susan Rice was expressing a willingness to cooperate. Quote, when it comes to China, we seek to operationalize a new model of major power relations. That means managing inevitable competition while forging deeper cooperation on issues where our interests converge, in Asia and beyond. Close quote. When Joe Biden was elected president in November 2020, one Chinese source was quoted saying, "Our president must be a little relieved. He knows Biden well."
Today I look at this classroom. This is a magnificent classroom. This whole complex. I just stood on a basketball court that was better than the basketball court I played on in the United States as when I was your age. So what I see is great, great, great progress. And that's the reason why the Vice President and I are spending so much time talking to one another. We both believe that our progress has to continue. We have a mutual interest. The United States, President Obama and Vice President Biden want to see a rising China. We don't fear a rising China. We welcome a rising China.
This narrative of relative stability and economic partnership runs contrary to the story about US-China relations often told by the Western popular press. China is vilified for human rights abuses and criticised for its communist ideology in the Western media. Chairman Mao Zedong referred to this constant backbiting between the US and China through media channels as the firing of, quote, empty cannons. In dialogue with Henry Kissinger in November 1973, Mao said, "So long as the objectives are the same, we would not harm you, nor would you harm us. Actually, it would be that sometime we want to criticize you for a while, and you want to criticize us for a while. That, your president said, is the ideological influence. You say, away with you communists. We say, away with you imperialists. Sometimes we say things like that." Close quote. In conversation with Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai in 1972, President Nixon echoed this sentiment and spoke of the importance of designing rhetoric that would appease anti-Chinese factions within the American political scene, whilst simultaneously maintaining a long-term strategic partnership. The greatest challenge to this understanding came in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square massacre. The American press and public were outraged at the images from Beijing that were beamed across the globe. Kissinger recalled that, in the aftermath of Tiananmen, the entire Sino-US relationship came under attack from across a wide political spectrum. Pressure was being applied on the US government to impose tough sanctions on China. In Congress, this effort was being driven by House Democrats Nancy Pelosi and Ben Jones.
And so we leave this remembrance to these young people and to their cause. In their memory, there is a memory which still burns bright, and it is a cause which will never die. No.
Chinese police then told Representatives Ben Jones of Georgia, Nancy Pelosi of California, and John Miller of Washington to leave the square. News crews were in the middle, and the CNN crew was pushed by police.
To President Bush and his wife Barbara, this visit to Beijing was a sort of homecoming. They lived here when Bush served as special envoy in 1974. For them, scenes like this horde of cyclists are a familiar sight.
President George H.W. Bush, however, was reluctant to act. He had served as America's de facto ambassador to China during Gerald Ford's administration, and he had forged a personable relationship with Chinese Premier and Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping. He had great admiration for the economic reforms Deng had introduced in the 1980s. Bush watered down the sanctions on China passed by the US Congress and sent Deng a personal letter, apologetic in tone, asking the Chinese leader to, quote, "Remember the principles on which my young country was founded. Those principles are democracy and freedom. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom from arbitrary authority," close quote. Bush went on to suggest that those principles had forced his hand, and that the sanctions, which included an arms embargo, could not be avoided. Crucially, Bush wrote, "We must not let the aftermath of the tragic recent events undermine a vital relationship patiently built up over the past 17 years.
To the health of you, Mr. President.
Bush's successor, Bill Clinton, elected in 1992, opted for an aggressive human rights approach with China in his first term. He had accused President Bush on the campaign trail of coddling China in the wake of the Tiananmen massacre, and was convinced that Communist China would soon be relegated to the history books, like its former communist counterparts in Eastern Europe. To force China's hand, his administration attempted to tie China's most favoured nation status, a designation which gives sovereign states favourable trading terms with the United States, to, quote, "dramatic improvements in the human rights situation in China," close quote. Clinton applied pressure for 2 years. He called for reform in China around issues like free emigration, prison labour, the treatment of peaceful protesters, and the observation of human rights as recognised by the United Nations. His efforts, however, met an aggressive response from Beijing. Clinton's Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, was rebuffed during a visit to the Chinese capital in 1994. Chinese officials made clear that China's human rights policy was none of America's business, and pointed out that the Americans had human rights issues of their own. Christopher's scheduled meeting with Jiang Zemin, who had replaced Deng as China's paramount leader, was cancelled, and he returned to the United States with his tail between his legs. Soon after, Clinton buckled and quietly extended China's most favoured nation status without any conditions relating to human rights. In 1997, Jiang Zemin visited the United States for talks with Clinton. The two leaders agreed to commit their countries to building a constructive strategic partnership oriented towards the 21st century. Later, China was granted permanent normal trade relations with the United States when it became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. In 2021, China was the largest source of imports to the American market. President Nixon wrote to President Reagan in 1982 that the major unifying factor that would draw the US and China closer and closer together in the coming decades could be, quote, "our economic interdependence." This was prescient on Nixon's part. Their interdependence has weathered Tiananmen, the suppression of the Tibetan uprising in 2008, the reports detailing mass detention and re-education camps in Xinjiang, and the ongoing US military intervention in the Middle East. The Biden administration has talked tough on China, calling the actions of the Chinese government in Xinjiang a genocide, and using incendiary rhetoric around the Taiwan issue. But history suggests that these concerns will eventually be sacrificed at the altar of economic growth, and a rapprochement between the two great Pacific powers, perhaps away from the column inches, will be forthcoming.
Mr. Prime Minister, Chairman Chiang, and our Chinese and American friends. This magnificent banquet marks the end of our stay in the People's Republic of China. We have been here a week. This was the week that changed the world. As we look back over this week, we think of the boundless hospitality that has been extended to all of us by our Chinese friends. We have today seen the progress of modern China. We have seen the matchless wonders of ancient China. We have seen also the beauty of the countryside, the vibrancy of a great city, Shanghai. All this we enjoyed enormously. But most important was the fact that we had the opportunity to have talks with Chairman Mao, with Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, with the Foreign Minister and other people in the government. The joint communique which we have issued today summarizes the results of our talks. But what we have said in that communique is not nearly as important as what we will do in the years ahead to build a bridge across 16,000 miles and 22 years of hostility which have divided us in the past. And what we have said today is that we shall build that bridge.